My name is Sarah, I'm 28, and I just discovered that my entire family has been lying to me for over a decade. What started as a simple conversation about my brother's new house turned into the most devastating revelation of my life. The money I thought was helping him chase his dreams. It was supposed to be mine all along, every single penny meant for my student loans that have been crushing me for years. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. When I found out the truth and decided to get my revenge, I uncovered a family secret so dark that it didn't just destroy relationships, it sent someone to prison. Hey everyone, before we dive into this absolutely wild family drama, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. If you're ready for a story that'll have you questioning everything you thought you knew about family loyalty, smash that like button and hit subscribe, because this revenge tale has more twists than a soap opera. Trust me, you won't see the ending coming. Growing up, everyone always told me how lucky I was to have such a close-knit family. My parents, Linda and Robert Martinez, seemed like the picture of middle-class success. Dad worked as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown, while Mom managed the local library branch. We lived in a modest but comfortable two-story house in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, complete with a white picket fence and a golden retriever named Buster. My younger brother Jake was always the golden child, 3 years my junior, but somehow always managed to be the center of attention. While I was the responsible one maintaining a 4 gigapascals and working part-time jobs throughout high school, Jake was the charismatic athlete who could charm his way out of any trouble. Teachers loved him, neighbors adored him, and our parents, well, they practically worshipped the ground he walked on. When it came time for college, I'd saved every penny from my part-time jobs, applied for countless scholarships, and still ended up taking out massive student loans to attend Arizona State University for my business degree. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, stress-eating cereal at midnight, while filling out loan applications, watching the numbers climb higher and higher. $60,000. That's what my education would cost me, and I accepted it as the price of my dreams. Jake, on the other hand, seemed to coast through everything. When he graduated high school 2 years after me, he announced he was taking a gap year to find himself. That gap year turned into 2, then 3. While I was grinding through internships and working weekends to pay for rent and groceries, Jake was traveling across Europe, posting Instagram photos from Paris cafes and Barcelona beaches. Whenever I asked how he afforded these adventures, Mom would wave her hand dismissively and say something about him saving up or finding great deals. After college, I landed a decent job at a marketing firm in Scottsdale, but between rent, utilities, groceries, and my student loan payments, I was barely scraping by. Every month, $547 went straight to loan payments, money that could have gone towards savings, a better apartment, or even just the occasional dinner that didn't come from a microwave. I watched friends buy houses, go on vacations, start families, while I remained stuck in a cycle of debt that felt never-ending. Meanwhile, Jake had finally decided to pursue his passion for photography. He enrolled in a prestigious art school in California, the kind of place that costs more per semester than most people make in a year. When I expressed surprise at how he could afford such an expensive program, Dad just shrugged and said Jake had figured it out. I assumed it meant more loans, more debt that he'd eventually have to face like the rest of us. But Jake never seemed stressed about money. While I was clipping coupons and buying generic brands, he was posting pictures of expensive camera equipment and weekend trips to Joshua Tree for artistic inspiration. He graduated from art school debt-free, or so he claimed, and immediately started talking about starting his own photography business. The photography business, as it turned out, was more of a pipe dream than a viable career plan. Jake took on a few wedding gigs and some family portraits, but mostly he seemed to spend his time networking at coffee shops and building his portfolio with unpaid projects. For 3 years after graduation, he lived in a cramped studio apartment in Venice Beach, claiming he was paying his dues in the industry. Then, 6 months ago, everything changed overnight. Jake called our family group chat, the one where Mom shared inspirational quotes and Dad sent us articles about financial planning that felt like passive-aggressive lectures about my spending habits with incredible news. He'd found the perfect house in Tempe just 20 minutes from where I lived. Not a starter home, not a fixer-upper, but a beautiful four-bedroom craftsman with a renovated kitchen, hardwood floors, and a backyard that looked like it belonged in a magazine. The asking price, $350,000 in cash. When I asked how he'd managed to save that much money, Jake's explanation was vague and constantly changing. First, it was his photography business taking off. Then it was smart investments he'd made with cryptocurrency and stocks. When I pressed for details, he'd change the subject or make jokes about me being too nosy about his finances. Our parents were over the moon about Jake's success. Mom couldn't stop talking about how proud she was of his entrepreneurial spirit and his ability to make his dreams come true. Dad nodded along, beaming with pride every time someone mentioned Jake's house. They attended his housewarming party, helped him move furniture, and posted Facebook photos of themselves in his gorgeous new kitchen with captions about their successful son. The first sign that something wasn't right came during Jake's housewarming party. I'd brought a bottle of wine and a congratulations card, trying to push down the bitter jealousy that had been eating at me for months. While everyone else celebrated, I couldn't help but notice small details that didn't add up. The house wasn't just nice, it was immaculate. Professional staging, high-end appliances, custom window treatments. This wasn't the home of someone who'd scraped together money from wedding photography gigs. As I wandered through the house, admiring the crown molding and granite countertops, I overheard a conversation between Jake and his friend Marcus near the kitchen island. They were talking in low voices, but I caught fragments that made my stomach turn. Can't believe your parents actually went through with it. Sarah doesn't know anything and it needs to stay that way, but what if she finds out about the Jake spotted me approaching and quickly changed the subject to something mundane about the mortgage rates? But those fragments stuck in my mind like splinters. What didn't I know? What did my parents go through with, and why did Marcus look so uncomfortable when he saw me? Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to conversations and interactions I'd previously ignored. During family dinners, there were awkward pauses whenever I mentioned my student loans or my tight budget. When I complained about having to skip a friend's destination wedding because I couldn't afford the plane ticket, my parents exchanged a look I couldn't quite interpret: guilt, discomfort, something else entirely. The second red flag came when I was helping Mom clean out her home office. She was finally digitizing years of financial records, and I offered to help sort through the boxes of paperwork. As I was organizing bank statements by year, I noticed something odd. There were regular large withdrawals from their savings account, amounts that seemed significant for a middle-class family. 15,000 here, 20,000 there, always around the same time Jake needed money for something. When I casually mentioned the withdrawals to Mom, she became flustered in a way I'd never seen before. She quickly gathered up the papers, muttering something about private family matters and suggesting I focus on sorting the tax documents instead. But not before I caught a glimpse of one particular withdrawal slip that made my blood run cold: $50,000 dated just 2 months before Jake bought his house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times I'd called home stressed about money, venting about how my student loan payments were preventing me from saving for a down payment on my own place. My parents had always been sympathetic, but never offered any concrete help beyond suggestions to budget better or look into loan consolidation. Meanwhile, they were apparently writing five-figure checks for Jake's adventures and investments. The third and most damning piece of evidence came from an unexpected source: our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She'd lived next door to my parents for 25 years and had watched Jake and me grow up. One Saturday afternoon, while I was visiting my parents and helping Dad with yard work, she came over to chat. "Your parents are so generous," she said, watching Dad trim the hedge. "Not every family would sacrifice their retirement savings for their children's education like that." I looked up from the flower bed I was weeding. "What do you mean about retirement savings, Mrs.?" Patterson looked confused. "Oh, I thought your father mentioned they'd used Sarah's college fund to help Jake get started with his business and house. I assumed you knew. He said it was always meant to be split between both of you anyway." The gardening tools slipped from my hands. My college fund, oh dear Mrs. Patterson, said her face flushing red. I think I've said something I shouldn't have. Perhaps I misunderstood, but she hadn't misunderstood. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. There had been a college fund money that was supposed to help pay for my education. Instead of using it for my tuition and loans, my parents had given it to Jake. While I'd been struggling with debt for years, believing that my family simply couldn't afford to help me, they'd been secretly funding my brother's lifestyle with money that was rightfully mine. I drove home in a daze, Mrs. Patterson's words echoing in my head. A college fund. Money that was meant for me given to Jake instead. By the time I reached my apartment, the hurt had transformed into rage. I spent the entire weekend researching, making phone calls, and piecing together a timeline that made me sick to my stomach. Monday morning, I took a personal day from work and drove straight to my parents' house. I found them in the kitchen, sharing coffee and reading the newspaper like it was any other peaceful morning. But this wasn't going to be peaceful. Not anymore. We need to talk, I announced, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Mom looked up with her usual warm smile. Of course, honey. What's on your mind, Mrs. Patterson told me something interesting on Saturday. About a college fund. My college fund. The newspaper crinkled as Dad's hands tightened around it. Mom's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Sarah, Dad finally said, setting down the paper with deliberate care. You should sit down. I'll stand, thanks. I want to hear about this fund that was apparently meant for my education but somehow ended up paying for Jake's house and his fancy art school and his European adventures. Mom's face had gone pale. Sweetheart, it's more complicated than no. It's really not complicated at all, I interrupted. Either there was money set aside for my college expenses that you gave to Jake instead, or there wasn't. Which is it? Dad stood up, running his hands through his graying hair. There was money. Your grandparents, my parents, they started a fund when you were born. They added to it every birthday, every Christmas. When Jake was born, they started one for him, too. So where's my money, Dad? We used it, Mom whispered, tears starting to form in her eyes. We used yours to help Jake because. Because what? Because he's the golden child who couldn't be expected to take out student loans like the rest of us. Because his dreams matter more than mine. Because he asked Dad suddenly. Exploded, his voice booming through the kitchen. Jake came to us when he was 18, said he had this incredible opportunity, this art program that would set him up for life. He begged us for help. You never asked Sarah. You just handled everything yourself, got your scholarships, took out your loans. We thought you were fine. The absurdity of his logic hit me like a physical blow. I never asked because I thought we couldn't afford it. I never asked because you taught me to be independent and responsible. I worked 2 jobs in college, Dad. I lived on ramen noodles for months at a time. I haven't taken a real vacation in 5 years because every spare dollar goes to loan payments. And all this time you had my money and gave it away because Jake asked for it. The fund was supposed to be split between both of you eventually, Mom said weakly. We always planned to help you pay off your loans once Jake was settled. Once Jake was settled? When exactly would that have been? He's 35 years old, Mom. When were you planning to tell me that my own inheritance was being used as his personal bank account? That's when Dad said the words that would haunt me forever. That money was for her loans. We were going to use what was left to help Sarah, but Jake needed what I screamed. Needed a house, needed to travel Europe, needed art school. What about what I needed? The fight continued for 2 hours. Through tears and shouting and accusations, the full scope of their betrayal emerged. The college fund my grandparents had started for me contained over $80,000 by the time I graduated high school. Instead of using it for my education, my parents had decided that since I was handling things so well on my own, they'd help Jake instead. The money had paid for his art school tuition, his living expenses during college, his post-graduation networking trips, and finally the down payment on his house. Every single penny of my inheritance had been spent on my brother's lifestyle while I struggled with debt that was never supposed to exist. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As I was preparing to leave disgusted, heartbroken, and planning to never speak to any of them again, Mom grabbed my arm with desperate force. Sarah, wait. There's something else you need to know. About Jake. About why we felt we had to help him. I don't want to hear any more excuses. He was stealing from us, she whispered. For years. Since he was a teenager. Money from my purse, checks from Dad's account, even jewelry that belonged to my mother. We never reported it because he's our son, but we were terrified he'd end up in real trouble if we didn't find another way to help him. Dad nodded, grimly. We thought if we just gave him what he needed, he'd stop taking things that weren't his. We were trying to protect him, and protect our family's reputation. Your grandfather was a respected man in this community. We couldn't bear the thought of Jake's behavior reflecting on the family name. I stared at them, my brain struggling to process this new information. You're telling me that you enabled a thief with my money. We were trying to help him change, Mom pleaded. We thought if he had financial security, he wouldn't feel the need to. To steal, I finished coldly. You sacrificed my future to cover up the fact that your golden boy is a criminal. That's when everything clicked into place. Jake hadn't changed at all. He'd just found a more sophisticated way to steal. And I was about to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person my family had been protecting. At this point in our story, I know many of you are probably feeling the same rage that was coursing through my veins. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any other kind of pain, doesn't it? If you've ever felt like the responsible child who gets overlooked while others get all the advantages, you'll understand what comes next. Make sure you're subscribed, because this revenge story is about to take a turn that even I didn't see coming. I left my parents' house that day with a mission. If Jake was the thief they claimed he was, and if my money had been used to enable his criminal behavior, then I was going to expose everything. But I needed proof, and I needed a plan that would ensure real consequences. My first stop was the Public Records Office. Jake's house purchase was a matter of public record, and I wanted to see exactly how that transaction had been structured. What I discovered was even more damning than I'd expected. The house hadn't been purchased with a traditional mortgage or even a cash payment from savings. Instead, it had been bought through a series of complicated financial maneuvers that raised immediate red flags. The property had been purchased by an LLC, Martinez Photography Holdings, that had been created just 3 months before the sale. The LLC's initial funding came from multiple sources: a $50,000 loan from my parents, a $20,000 withdrawal from what appeared to be a business account, and several smaller transfers that I couldn't immediately trace. But it was the business account that caught my attention. I spent the next week doing research that would make a private investigator proud. Jake's photography business, it turned out, had been far more active than any of us realized. He'd been contracted for dozens of events over the past 2 years, not just weddings and family portraits, but corporate events, real estate, photography, and even some work for local businesses. The problem wasn't that he wasn't working. The problem was where the money from that work was going. Using social media, business registration websites, and even some clever phone calls where I posed as a potential client, I began mapping out Jake's professional network. What I found was a pattern of financial irregularities that made my stomach turn. Several clients mentioned paying Jake for services that were never delivered. Others talked about deposits that disappeared when Jake suddenly became unavailable for their events. The breakthrough came when I contacted a woman named Jennifer, who had hired Jake for her wedding the previous summer. She was happy to talk about her experience, though it quickly became clear why. "Oh, Jake Martinez," she said when I called, claiming to be considering him for a family event. "I would stay far away from him if I were you. He took our $1,500 deposit and then disappeared 2 weeks before our wedding. We had to scramble to find another photographer, and we never got our money back." "Did you report this to anyone?" I asked, my heart racing. "We filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau and considered taking him to small claims court, but our lawyer said it would cost more than we'd recover. We just wrote it off as a expensive lesson." Jennifer wasn't alone. Over the next few days, I found 6 other clients with similar stories. Deposits taken, services not delivered, and Jake vanishing whenever confronted about the money. The amounts ranged from $500 to $3,000, and in total he'd stolen nearly $15,000 from unsuspecting couples and businesses. But the real bombshell came when I decided to dig deeper into his art school financing. I called the financial aid office, claiming to be Jake's sister, helping him organize his tax documents. The administrator I spoke with was surprisingly helpful. Mr. Martinez was one of our scholarship recipients, she explained. He received the Henderson Family Grant, which covers full tuition for students from underrepresented communities pursuing visual arts degrees. It's quite prestigious. We only award 2 per year. My blood ran cold. So his tuition was covered by a scholarship completely. In fact, he also received a stipend for living expenses through our work-study program. Very few students graduate with as much financial support as Mr. Placis. Martinez received. Jake hadn't just stolen my college fund, he'd done it under completely false pretenses. The money my parents gave him for art school tuition had been pure profit since his education was already paid for. He'd been running a con on our entire family while simultaneously stealing from his clients. That night, I sat in my apartment with a legal pad mapping out every financial crime Jake had committed that I could prove. Client theft, fraud regarding the art school expenses, and what appeared to be tax evasion since he clearly wasn't reporting all his income. The college fund theft wasn't technically illegal since our parents had willingly given him the money, but everything else was a different story. I also made a list of every person who had been hurt by Jake's actions, the couples who'd lost their wedding deposits, the businesses that had paid for services they never received, and me, the sister whose future had been mortgaged to enable a criminal. We all deserved justice. My plan was simple but comprehensive. I would gather every piece of evidence I could find, contact every victim I could locate, and then present everything to the authorities in a package so complete that Jake wouldn't be able to talk his way out of consequences. But first, I was going to confront him directly and record every word he said. I spent 2 weeks perfecting my approach. I needed Jake to incriminate himself without realizing what was happening, which meant I had to swallow my rage and play the role of supportive sister. It was the hardest acting job of my life. I texted Jake, asking if we could meet for coffee to talk about some family stuff. He suggested his house, probably wanting to show off his ill-gotten gains once more. Perfect. I agreed immediately. When I arrived at his house that Saturday morning, I came prepared. My phone was recording in my pocket, I had copies of all my research in my car, and I had a script planned out that would hopefully get him to admit to everything he'd done. Jake greeted me with his usual charming smile, offering me coffee from his expensive espresso machine. We sat in his gorgeous living room, surrounded by photography equipment that I now knew had been purchased with stolen money, and I began my performance. I wanted to talk to you about something Mom and Dad told me. I started keeping my voice casual, about the college fund situation. Jake's smile flickered slightly. Oh, that... Yeah, they mentioned you'd found out about it. Look, Sarah, I'm sorry it worked out that way. I never meant for you to feel like... Actually, I'm not here to guilt trip you about it, I interrupted, forcing myself to sound understanding. I mean, it sucks that I didn't know about the money, but I get it. You asked for help when you needed it, and I didn't. That's on me. Relief flooded his features. Exactly. You've always been so independent, so capable. Mom and Dad knew you could handle things on your own, right? And honestly, looking at how well your photography business is doing, it seems like their investment paid off. This house, all your equipment, you've really built something impressive. That's when Jake made his first major mistake. Pride overtook caution, and he started bragging about his financial success in ways that contradicted everything he'd told the family before. The business has been incredible, he boasted. I mean, the profit margins in wedding photography are insane when you know how to work the system. Most photographers are too honest for their own good, you know. What do you mean by that? I asked innocently. Well, like take deposits. Most photographers will just ask for a small amount up front, maybe 20%. But I ask for 50% minimum, sometimes more if I can get it. And here's the thing, if something comes up and you can't deliver, you've already got most of your money. The couple is so stressed about their wedding that they usually don't fight too hard to get deposits back. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice steady. That's really smart business sense. Exactly, and the art school thing was genius too? I applied for every scholarship and grant they offered, told them all these sob stories about being a disadvantaged student. Full ride plus living expenses while mom and dad were sending me money thinking they were paying for tuition. I stared at him, barely believing he was admitting all of this so casually. So the scholarship covered everything, everything and then some. I probably made money going to college when you factor in all the grants and the family contributions. That's how I had the seed money to really get the business going. For the next hour, Jake detailed his various schemes with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. He told me about clients whose deposits he'd kept when he got a better offer for their wedding date. He bragged about inflating his expenses when billing corporate clients. He even mentioned several times when he'd borrowed equipment from other photographers and never returned it. But the most damning revelation came when I asked about his future plans. "I'm actually thinking about expanding," he said excitedly. "Maybe starting an event planning business too. The markup potential is incredible, especially when you're working with people who are emotional about their events. Stressed brides and anxious corporate managers will pay anything if you know how to sell them on it." "That sounds like a great opportunity," I managed to say. "The key is building trust quickly and getting as much money upfront as possible. Once you have their deposit, you have all the power in the relationship. They're not going to risk losing their money by backing out even if you don't deliver exactly what you promised." As I sat there listening to my brother describe his criminal business model with such casual enthusiasm, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about the college fund anymore. This was about justice for everyone Jake had stolen from and preventing him from victimizing anyone else. When I left his house that day, I had everything I needed. Jake had confessed to deposit fraud, scholarship fraud, theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud, all recorded in high-definition audio on my phone. He'd even mentioned specific clients and amounts, giving me details I hadn't been able to uncover through my own research. That evening, I began making phone calls. The next month was a whirlwind of police reports, lawyer consultations, and victim statements. I contacted every person and business that Jake had stolen from, offering to help them file formal complaints and providing them with evidence I'd gathered. The response was overwhelming. Far more people had been victimized than I'd initially realized. Detective Maria Rodriguez from the Scottsdale Police Department took my case seriously from day one. When I presented her with the recorded confession, the financial records I'd compiled, and statements from over a dozen victims, she immediately opened an investigation into Jake's activities. "This level of systematic fraud is exactly what we need to prosecute," she told me during our second meeting. "Your brother has been operating what essentially amounts to a criminal enterprise, and the evidence you've provided gives us everything we need to shut it down." The investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, Jake was arrested at his house on multiple charges: fraud, theft, conspiracy, and tax evasion. The arrest was covered by local news stations, with reporters standing in front of his beautiful craftsman home while describing the elaborate scheme that had funded his lifestyle. But the real satisfaction came when the financial reckoning began. Jake's assets were frozen immediately pending investigation. The house he'd bought with my college fund was seized as proceeds of criminal activity. His photography equipment, his car, even his bank accounts, everything was held as potential evidence or restitution for his victims. My parents were devastated, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of defending Jake or blaming me for destroying the family, they seemed almost relieved that the truth was finally out. Years of covering up his behavior, making excuses, and enabling his criminal activity had taken a toll on them that I'd never fully understood. "We knew this day would come eventually," Dad admitted during one of our difficult conversations. "We just hoped that if we kept helping him, he'd change before anyone got seriously hurt." "People did get seriously hurt," I reminded him. "Including me." "I know. And we're going to make it right." Making it right turned out to be more complicated than anyone anticipated. The legal process took 8 months, during which Jake pleaded guilty to multiple felonies in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was ordered to pay restitution to all his victims, serve 18 months in prison, and complete 5 years of probation. The restitution process was where karma truly showed its hand. Since Jake's assets weren't sufficient to cover everything he'd stolen, the court looked into all sources of funding for his criminal activities. That included the college fund money my parents had given him, which the judge ruled had been obtained under false pretenses since Jake had lied about needing it for school expenses. My parents were ordered to surrender documentation about the original college fund, including the specific amounts that had been intended for my education. What we discovered was staggering. The fund had actually contained $96,000 when I graduated high school, not the $80,000 they'd initially claimed. With interest and proper investment growth over the years I'd been paying student loans, that money should have been worth over $120,000. The court ordered that the full amount be paid to me as part of Jake's restitution, with my parents contributing the funds they'd given him since they had knowingly participated in the fraud. It took them 6 months to liquidate investments and savings to come up with the money, but eventually I received a check for $123,000. I paid off my student loans in full that same day. The remaining money became the down payment on my own house, a beautiful townhome just 10 minutes from my office, purchased legitimately with money that had always rightfully been mine. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months after Jake's conviction, when I received a letter from Jennifer, the bride whose wedding deposit he'd stolen. "Sarah," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that we received full restitution from your brother's case, plus interest. But more than that, I wanted to thank you for having the courage to do what was right, even though it meant going against your own family. Because of you, Jake can't steal from anyone else, and people like us got justice we never thought we'd see." The ripple effects continued for months. Jake's conviction made local news again when other victims came forward, leading to additional charges in neighboring counties. His photography business was permanently shut down, and he was banned from operating any business involving advance deposits as part of his probation terms. My relationship with my parents slowly began to heal, though it took time and family therapy to work through the betrayal and resentment. They sold their house and moved to a smaller place, using the proceeds to pay their share of my restitution and to start rebuilding their retirement savings. As for Jake, he served his full sentence and was released last month. He's living in a halfway house, working at a grocery store, and paying monthly restitution to his remaining victims. The last I heard, he was struggling to find housing because his criminal record makes him ineligible for most rental properties. The irony isn't lost on me. The man who stole money meant for my future now can't afford a future for himself. Today, I'm mortgage-free at 29, debt-free for the first time in my adult life, and building the savings account I always dreamed of having. I've started a blog about financial literacy and family financial abuse that's gained a following among other victims of similar situations. Most importantly, I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to hold them accountable for their actions, even when it's painful. The house Jake bought with my stolen inheritance was sold at auction. I drove by it once just to see who ended up with it. It was a young couple with a baby, moving in boxes and hanging pictures. They looked happy, excited about their future. That house is now filled with honest dreams instead of criminal schemes, and somehow that feels like the perfect ending to this story. You know what's funny about family karma? People always say that blood is thicker than water, but they never finish the quote. The full saying is, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb," meaning that chosen relationships built on trust and shared values are stronger than family relationships based on nothing but genetics. Jake chose to betray that trust, and he learned the hard way that actions have consequences even within families. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Have you dealt with financial betrayal or discovered that people you trusted were stealing from you? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes sharing these experiences helps us all feel less alone in dealing with difficult family situations. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and share it with anyone who might need to hear that it's okay to stand up for yourself, even against family members who've wronged you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about real-life justice and the importance of holding people accountable for their actions. From my experience to yours, remember that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. Thanks for listening to my story, and I hope it reminds you that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting the truth come to light. Stay strong and remember that you deserve to be treated with honesty and respect, especially by the people who claim to love you most.